The night was quiet across the moorlands. A tattered shawl of wispy fog clung to the piled stone fences and occasional cairns that dotted the landscape. The grass was damp with recent rain, and the occasional rumble of thunder lingered in the sky. Clouds danced over a waxing moon that shone brightly. An ancient leafless oak tree curled over the roof of the manor chapel and its adjacent cemetery. Scrape. The blade of a rusty old spade cut into the damp earth at the bottom of a freshly dug hole. The gravedigger tossed a load of dirt over his shoulder. It came down with a thud next to a lumpy linen bundle lying on the grass. The man could see well enough from the dim light of the moon, but he longed for a lantern to chase away shadows. The lord of the manor, for some unknown reason, had asked specifically that he bring no light this night. The grave was also to be dug behind the chapel, on the far side of the cemetery, out of view from the road. The gravedigger didn't ask what, or more likely who, the linen bundle contained. His superstitions discouraged him from getting tangled up in any evil or injustice. He avoided touching the bundle directly, pretending he couldn't perceive its contents. He'd brought it to the graveyard in a wheelbarrow and pulled it by a length of rope coming off one end. What had motivated the lord of the manor to make such odd requests he couldn't imagine. Most likely guilt or shame, or possibly even fear. As far as the gravedigger was concerned, the less he knew the better. He was shrewd enough to haggle the price of the deed. He received the promise of enough money to cover his recent debts, and more. All this in exchange for his labor and a promise of secrecy. The spade's cadence of scrape and thud drowned out any thought of wickedness. The steady rhythm still couldn't completely dissipate the tinge of unease lingering in the gravedigger's mind. He imagined each thud of earth as a footstep toward his wash basin, where he could rid himself of the grime of his task. He continued digging as a cloud passed in front of the moon, casting a shadow into the bottom of the grave. Continuing blindly, he drove the spade into the earth to keep a consistent rhythm. Scrape, thud. Scrape, thud. He knew the grave was almost deep enough. He noticed another sound gradually become perceptible in his cadence. Scrape, thud. Scrape, thud. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he stopped to listen closer. The unsurprising chirp of crickets and his own labored breathing were all he heard. He held his breath for a moment, but heard nothing else. No breathing, no footsteps, no sign of anyone else in the graveyard. Had he just imagined the sound? The monotony of digging must have made his own breathing more perceptible to his mind. The darkness of the night and the darkness of his task made everything seem more sinister and threatening. The cloud that covered the moon had now passed, and he continued to dig, now at a faster pace. Scrape, thud. Scrape, thud. Scrape, thud. He stopped again. What he heard definitely sounded like breathing, but he was almost certain it hadn't matched his own. He peered over the edge of the grave in which he stood and saw shadows scattered about the gravestones. The gnarled branches of the ancient oak sent out writhing tendrils of darkness that clawed and grasped at the gravestones. Eerie as they were, nothing among the menacing shadows appeared human or animal. He stood with his gaze fixed, trying to perceive any movement in the darkness. There was none. He turned to look out the other side of the grave and saw nothing apart from the linen bundle that was soon to take his place. He stared wide-eyed at the bundle, fearing he might see the rising and falling of a human chest. The linen lay motionless. Apprehensively, he reached out a hand to investigate. He took hold of the length of rope on the end of the bundle and shook it vigorously. The contents lay still as the linen jostled over it. He reached out a hand to feel the middle of the bundle and shuddered as he felt the unmistakable cold resistance of lifeless flesh. He pulled his hand back quickly, having no desire to feel or know more about what lay inside. Looking back toward the other gravestones, he called out,
"Who's there?"
A gentle breeze was all that replied. causing the twisted oak branches to creak and moan.
"Whoever you are, you shouldn't be here."
Once again, there was no reply. The quiet of the night bore down heavily, and another cloud drifted over the moon.
"It's not safe at night,"
he called out half to himself. The gravedigger knew whatever presence he felt in the darkness must not be physical. He had heard stories of ghosts and demons before, but always counted them as hogwash. Cowering in the corner of the grave, he set down his spade and bundled his cloak around him. He hadn't realized how cold the night had become. Whether unseen spirits did in fact have power over the physical world, he couldn't say. Up until now, he had never wished to find out. But here, in his fear and desperation, he decided an appeal to spirits might allay his fears. Mustering a loud and confident voice, he yelled out,
"Spirits, I am humble and God-fearing man. I am only here to lay a departed soul to rest. Whatever quarrel you have, I desire no part in it. I'll finish up here and be on my way. Let no harm come to me."
He stood there in silence, holding his breath, and waited for any sign of a reply. Fog danced between the gravestones, but he saw no other movement and heard no unusual sounds. After a drawn-out moment of silence, a heavy sigh escaped his lungs. He noticed his hands clenched in tight fists as he released them from his cloak and let them fall by his sides. One hand found the familiar handle of his spade, and he remembered his task. He chuckled at his irrationality. Taking up the spade once more, he resumed his familiar cadence. Scrape. Thud. Silly as it was, his plea did bring him comfort. There was a certain measure of peace in the sound of his own voice. He started thinking out loud, muttering to himself as the spade continued its steady rhythm.
"If there's anyone for spirits to be angered by, it'd be the Manor Lord. He's the real reason I'm here, after all. I'm just doing a job, just following orders, and for good cause too. Making good on my promises, I am. Repaying my debts. No harm will come to me. There'd be no justice in it."
As soon as the words left his lips, he heard it again. The man froze, rooted to the bottom of the grave, now ready to welcome him. There was no mistaking it this time. The wheeze had come from behind him, from the direction of the linen bundle. He stood still in the silence, listening closely. He noticed the silence that now enveloped the entire cemetery was suddenly more profound than before. No crickets chirped, no boughs creaked in the breeze. He heard only the pounding of his own heart and that dreadful wheeze. The gravedigger slowly turned back toward the bundle. Empty linen lay flat on the grass where the body had once been. He fell back against the wall of the grave, frozen in horror. Closer than ever before, the wheezing breath gradually rose up directly above him, accompanied by a long shadow. His last spoken words echoed in his mind.
"No harm will come to me. There'd be no justice in it."
"No," rasped a high, wheezing voice. "There isn't."